Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with information on how it impacts you. Plus, today we are talking about the federal budget, the consolidation of some programs, at least the proposed consolidation of programs. We've got two experts on the field to tell us a little bit about what you can expect and what you may not expect in that federal budget.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it's just after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Dr. Edgar Zazwata, ACSA's Executive Director. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome. We're honored to have you with us here on a Wednesday. Go ahead and jump into the chat and say hello and let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, how are you?
Good. I'm doing great, Naj. I hope you're doing well. I was going to give you, I was going to say, so though you're such a pro at this, right? And that intro, I know, the intro is the only part that kind of trips you up sometimes, whether it be my name, my title, those pieces, right? And last week I noticed that you're rocking the glasses there. I thought it was maybe so you could read your notes for the intro,
right?
But you kind of slipped up today, even with the glasses. So.
I said this before we came on. If I pop these glasses off, you look fuzzy. Like I can't even see. You could hold up fingers for numbers, and I can't see. So it's either my vision is getting worse or I'm becoming old. It's one or the other.
Yet another reminder. We've been at this for a little while, right?
We certainly have. Coming up, we're going to talk about the federal budget. Kevin Gordon, president and partner at Capital Advisors, and Noah Ellison Ng from AASA will join us to talk about the federal budget. What is coming from our federal government as far as a proposal is concerned? What is real? What may not happen? We'll dive into that coming up in just a couple of seconds. Want to say hello to some of our viewers that are out here. Jason Engel first on the chat with us today. Neri Pais is there. Sheldon Smith, of course. Edgar, we're talking about budget. We're talking about money. Sheldon was going to be on there. And he was on 3 minutes before we even came on the air.
Yeah, he never misses Patty or Kevin. I don't know. Not always on for us, just on a week-to-week basis. But one of them are on. We know he's going to be on. So I'm always happy to have him.
Something tells me Sheldon has like some insider information as to when we're going to talk about budget, and Kevin or Patty is going to be on. Like suddenly he gets an alert, and that's how he knows to tune in. Let's get some news headlines first. At the state capitol, the Senate Education Committee met this morning, and now the Assembly Education Committee meeting this afternoon. One of the pieces of legislation that they are going over today discussing is ACSA's co-sponsored bill. That's AB 2490 by Assemblymember Valencia. ACSA's Region 9 Vice President for Legislative Action, Dr. Don Hubble, who is the Director of Human Resources at Merced City Elementary School District, is one of the two lead witnesses testifying in support of the measure. AB 2490, for those of you keeping track at home, seeks to provide continuity to students by allowing the use of 60-day substitutes for both general ed and special ed settings. If we get any information about that hearing going on before our show is complete, we'll certainly pass that along to you. Also want to bring this to your attention. The ACSA Board of Directors has unanimously voted to endorse California State Assembly Member Al Muratsuchi for State Superintendent of Public Instruction. ACSA conducted a comprehensive evaluation of all of the SBI candidates, including questionnaires, interviews with the board. Of course, there were interviews that we had on there, thorough review of each candidate's record. For Muratsuchi, elected to the Assembly in 2012, represents 8066, which includes Torrance and Redondo Beach and Gardena and Rancho Palos Verdes. He's a community college adjunct professor, a former school board president, and previously served as chair of both the Assembly Education Committee and the Assembly Budget Committee on Education Finance. He's led the effort to strengthen the local control funding formula authored Proposition 2, which was the $10 billion statewide school bond measure approved by voters in 2024, and authored the California Safe Haven School Act to ensure schools remain safe and welcoming for students. In recognition of his leadership, Edgar, he received the ACSA Friend of Education Public Education Award in 2023. A very thorough process that the board went through before identifying and ultimately supporting the assembly member as our state school public instruction superintendent.
Yeah, we our board was very deliberate on, you just named them, the interviews. We had a number of the candidates, to the videos that were accessible to all, coming to our events. And there were some good, compelling candidates there. Other candidates that the organization has had good relationships with. I think where it came down to this endorsement for Al Muratsuchi is his proven track record. I mean, you just outlined all the positions he's taken, that he's had. I think when it comes to ACSA and the administrators, I've said this to him many times as I've introduced them at our events. Of all the folks that we work with, I can't think of one who's been more diligent about asking how our members feel about a potential policy, or being responsive to the voice of the administrators. I think that's where he really differentiated himself. And and I always joke, the legislators, at one point or another, they're going to disappoint us, right? They're going to take a vote that we don't like. They'll introduce a bill that we are not the biggest fans of, whatnot. But I think Al Muratsuchi, what I've always appreciated about him is how he responds to that, right? When our folks have feedback about potential legislation, when he's thinking about implementation. And so I'm excited. I'm excited for the board's decision. I know it's a race that hasn't got a ton of attention.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is also a race that we think at ACSA we'll be able to influence in terms of our endorsement, and we're going to be putting the word out and giving the assembly members some more opportunities to get his perspectives out. I invite our folks that, I know the interviews are still on our website there, to go check out what Al has had to say about all of the issues. I know that's one piece that we will really be pushing here before the primary in June. And I think this is a compelling take. Just to show his reach, he is the only candidate now who has endorsements both from school employees and CSEA. He got, he has the CFT, the teachers endorsement, and now has school leaders. So just, he's coalescing in terms of broad support from all angles. So yeah, we're obviously going to encourage our folks to go out and support Muratsuchi for SPI as we move into election season.
Yeah, and we did do an interview with Assemblymember Muratsuchi a few weeks back. We'll put a link to that in our chat. That is currently up on YouTube, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. We talked to him for about 15 minutes, went about talking about his platform, what he's looking forward to accomplishing, and what some of the big challenges are right now in California public education that he would like to help school leaders work through. So that is up on our YouTube page. If you want to take a look at that link, we'll make that available for you. Okay, federal budget, right? Not the most exciting thing, Edgar, but there are some particulars that are impactful here in our state and to our California public school students. We've got experts in the field on our show today to talk about that. Noelle Ellerson-Ng is the Chief Advocacy and Government Officer at AASA. Kevin Gordon, President and Partner at Capital Advisors. Noelle and Kevin, thanks so much for joining us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Kevin, we corresponded yesterday. Yep. The headline originally was that the administration's education budget is nearly $2.5 billion less than last year, a small cut relative to just the larger federal budget. But that depends completely on whether you have gone into the details of it. So I will ask you, and then Noelle, I'll have you follow up. From what you've been reading, does this further signal the effort to shrink the Department of Education? Kevin, we'll have you start.
Yeah, and Noelle knows this way better than I do, so it's awesome to have her be part of this program today. You guys know that you're lucky to have her on board. But I'm going to basically be copying from you, Noelle, because I listen to you all the time. But it's really the narrative is that old saying, figures lie and liars figure. Well, you got to be careful about who the messenger is and some of the stuff that you're reading, but that because of the nuances of the budget, where the president and the White House puts more money into Pell Grants to fill up a hole that they have. It skews the narrative about really how much they're cutting. The look we had yesterday, it looked like it was as big a cut or bigger than the one that they had last year. Essentially, they're doing a rerun of an effort to cut all kinds of education programs again, just like they did last year, with the outcome, in my view, being the same, which is that as long as they have to get 7 Democrat votes in the U.S. Senate and the 10 Republican U.S. senators that objected to a lot of the administration's efforts to cut education last year, we're never going to see most of these cuts, if any of them, come to pass. But it does mean we have to be activists. We have to articulate the damage cuts like this do. We can't just sort of rest on the fact that maybe they can't put the votes together and, what the dynamics are in DC. We have to articulate what we think the actual impact of these reductions are. But yeah, it's still, he's getting rid of 30 programs that are $8.4 billion, and that's completely getting rid of them. He's cutting other programs. But if you remember, the cut last year was in the magnitude of about $12 billion. I've heard a number as big as $15 billion. But again, people are using the numbers that the president is putting into Pell, for example, which we care about, but it's not a K-12 program, as a sort of a way of masking sort of what the real cuts are to education.
Noel, I'll have you take your feedback on this. I mean, are we saying this basically as an example, a signal about that effort to shrink the U.S. Department of Education?
The short answer is yes, but I'm from DC, so I have a longer answer. I want to pick up on something that Kevin said towards the latter half of his response, which is we accept the budget as the proposal that it is. We respect the budget for the step in the process that it always represents. And at the same time, we hold space for the fact that in a trend that predates President Obama, the president's budget is largely a performative measure that indicates where the administration is. And you won't really see any substantive response until we see a marker from Congress. And to emphasize what Kevin was starting to get at, if we want Congress to do what it did last year and defend against the cuts, we need to make sure they have cover for it. So yes, they've done good to make a bad budget less bad, but we need to make sure they have the cover for it, especially in a time when it's a Congress that does seem pretty beholden to the president and what might be a flex or an area of follow-up if he doesn't feel that his proposals are getting the attention they need. Generally, when we looked at the overall budget, the devil is in the details. I like Kevin's expression, figures are, whatever you opened with about how we're going to figure and where the facts lie. But it is a rinse, wash, and repeat, right? We see another budget that calls for funding cuts, block grants, and program eliminations. But when you look at a top line that's proposing to cut the budget by $2.3 billion, our lane of focus is K-12. And it actually cuts K-12 funding by roughly $6.5 billion. That's a very, very deep cut for education. But our first step in a budget process is always to take a breath. And we're alarmed that this is the type of proposal we see from an administration of any color, because don't tell me your priorities, show me your budget and you show me your priorities. This shows a budget that doesn't prioritize education. And at the same time, while we can be alarmed, we're not going to be alarmist, because we know this ultimately has to get through not just the Senate, where you need 7 to cross over, but the House has signed off on all of the budgets in recent years that have been markedly less bad than what the House itself has introduced, which often mirrors where the president is. And so I'll stop there. We have a lot more thoughts on a lot of the details, but there's some really good questions that let us unpack that further into the conversation today.
No, I always appreciate you keeping it in perspective here, and that's why we appreciate when you come on and just the broader support from AASA. I know giving us that national landscape and keeping track at a level that, obviously we try to keep track of these, but we really rely on your folks' support there. So thank you for all your work. And on that note, I know I see one of our board members who represents California, Julie Vitale, who's on the AASA governing board. I know it does a lot of our work at the national level. So on paper, the proposal, from what we've seen, it proposes to keep funding steady at Title I, Impact Aid, Indian education, to name a few, at least on paper, right? And also there was some talk of this new block grant. Can you give us some understanding of, what is this proposed block grant?
The block grant is not new, and I think we have to be fair and acknowledge that there were proposals with Secretary Duncan and President Obama to do some block grants. But I think there's a very different premise with an Obama administration that was focused on prioritizing and protecting public education. That's a very different type of block grant conversation than what we see here under the Trump administration, who does remain consistent in its effort to cut the Department of Ed, eliminate the Department of Ed, under the euphemism of returning things to the state, paved the way for cutting and gutting a role for federal support in education. I think in a tongue-in-cheek or cute proposal, one of the consolidations that is proposed takes 17 programs that currently are worth 6.5 billion and just, can put it in a block grant and fund it at 2 billion and, no damage to the kids there. This grant proposal, the consolidated program, would be called the Make Education Great Again program, mega program, with a mega cut is how I would summarize that. Most notably, those consolidated programs include the Rural Ed Achievement Program, which I know that some of our California members are very active on, and Title II Part A, supporting effective instruction. You can't cut off a sustained stream of funding to something as important as teacher pathways and argue in good faith that it's not going to impact education. I do want to call out too that when we look at some of the eliminations for programs that are cut, it's Title I Part C, migrant education, Title III Part A, which is English language acquisition, special programs for migrant students, and teacher quality partnership program. So yes, Title I, impact aid, Indian education, they're all protected. And that's good. If we're level setting with my appropriator advocate hat on, getting no cuts in this budget environment is a good thing. That's about as good as we can get. But in the context of the overall budget, I've been asked before in a situation like this, what's a children's book that you would rename under the guise of a budget proposal? And I would say education in the horrible, terrible, no good, very bad, like proposal, right? There's nothing super good about this. At the same time, when you got to put in context of where the administration is. And this is very consistent. And this is a fair, transparent document that we can respond to and work with as it moves forward to the next steps.
Folks, if you have questions for Noelle and Kevin, go ahead and put those into the chat. We'll tackle some of those near the end of our broadcast.
I wanted to, if I can too,
go ahead.
I just wanted to underscore something that you said, Noelle, so people get this. There is a tendency to be attracted to the idea of a block grant. Is that, look, let's take all the rules. I mean, Jerry Brown, right, did it here in California, right, with LCFF. The notion of a block grant with all these programs, Noelle mentioned 17 programs are in there, but accompanied by a 69% cut to what we were spending on those things isn't the kind of flexibility I want to have. So if you're going to return to us local control and you want to take a whole bunch of programs that currently exist all across the country and say, we're going to just send this out to you on a per kid basis or whatever the funding distribution formula is, and you get to decide what to do with it, is a different kind of conversation than one that starts out with the idea of nearly a 70% cut. If they could just help themselves and say, we're not going to cut that, they might get some traction from the education community in many parts of the country. But they can't help themselves, so they put that big old cut in there, and I think it's just a giant anchor around the political traction that this thing may end up not being able to get. So,
and one more thing to tie it all together, to the extent that I talked about how there have been proposals to do block grants before, I think there's a different amount of attention to be paid this year because in the current administration, current Trump administration, there has been steady rhetoric and other policy levers that do return things to the state, whether that's actual policy authority or far more relevant here, some administrative burden as there's less staffing at the federal level and there's more work to be done at the state level. I do think that this type of block grant would presumably provide more authority at the state level. And that's where we follow very closely because superintendents are historically familiar. In our position at AASA is we like block grants to the local level with guardrails to ensure that the key tenets and elements of the policy supporting the program are in place or enforced. And to the extent that we don't think that would track with this administration isn't going to want to return block grant to the state level, but also highly police it and enforce it to make sure that all the right people are served and all the right students are served and the program is run to a certain standard. So this is a non-starter for AASA. We oppose the proposed consolidation, but I do think there's a different set of legs under this proposal as it hits the ground running because it does align with their broader mantra of returning things to the states, cutting the Department of Ed, getting the federal government out of education.
Yep.
Kevin, with Prop 98 providing base level funding in California, we already have seen the governor's budget proposal to hold back some state dollars until a little bit later on in the budget process. So, how should lawmakers respond to any of these proposed cuts? And I guess the second part of that question is, if you're a school district and you're also in that budgeting process right now, how do you have to plan? How do you kind of have to put up your guardrails in the event that some of these cuts actually do take place?
Yeah, and we've seen that ever since the current administration came to Washington, D.C. This, our normal way of budgeting, and, I think everybody on this call knows this, is that when we see a governor's budget, that you're not trying to get ahead of what those projections are, even though they're really important to know. Like, for example, the governor's overall budget projections for revenue and what we're entitled to in Prop 98 it's a lot rosier than the governor started out with in January, but you don't budget to that. You budget basically what the governor puts on the table. Well, from a standpoint of Washington, D.C., predicating your budgets, if you are dependent in a significant way on federal dollars, whatever you're dependent on, predicating your budget on the possibility they get cut as a result of the proposals is something that we don't advise. Like, for example, when we first saw some of what the president was doing and the timeline when he came into office, there was a lot of angst about the March layoff dates and whether or not there were certain programs where we needed to issue layoff notices, because the president was talking about zeroing out programs for which were the lifeline, the dollars for these positions. And a lot of the advice that we collectively gave was, don't rush into that right now, because as Noel was saying, that most of the time what these budgets represent is, again, a statement of kind of where they are, what they would love to have happen, but it's just extremely hard to get it. In fact, the entire time of the first administration, Trump's first administration, he proposed cuts, deep cuts, every single year and never got them. I mean, Noel, you may know that he got maybe some of them, but for the most part, I don't think he got very much, if any. And so I wouldn't want you to try to predicate your budget on that. The state situation is a little bit different. Believe me, we will leverage the volatility of this proposal the president has to get legislators to understand how important it is not to take $5.6 billion of Prop 98 money the governor is borrowing to spend on something else, and make sure schools have those resources in the face of potential cuts on the federal level. But at the end of the day, as you guys are thinking about your budgets in your districts, I don't think you run outside of the room with your hair on fire over this thing. We do have work to do in terms of advocacy, but I think we're going to be able to beat these cuts if we work together.
And this will go over, I know, Kevin, you like talking about the policy, Noel too, so I'll kind of throw it to both of you, and it gives me a chance to acknowledge our president, Darrell Camp there, who threw in a question, who I will say we talked about the Muratsuchi endorsement. He, at the credit, I don't know how much he was looking forward to this process, but he shepherded this whole thing and getting us to the decision. So appreciate Dr. Camp's leadership there. He asked about California redistricting and the impact on federal funding. And he brings up the example of Kevin Kiley now being an independent and how that may impact other California Republican representatives. Kevin, I know you pay obviously more attention in California, and then I'll let Noel jump in and add anything on.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, in all likelihood, Republicans are going to have fewer seats in Congress from California when this is all done. We'll see what happens with regard to the makeup of the entire House of Representatives, but we're in for some big changes if, in fact, all the predictions about a change in the composition of the House in terms of where the majority goes in November occurs. Now, we are still going to have, with the president and the White House and the U.S. Senate, if it stays in Republican hands, you're going to still have a lot of gridlock. But it's kind of interesting to note that when we've had this dynamic before, where we had sort of split government between the two houses of Congress and a Republican in the White House, we had exactly the same dynamic Noel pointed out earlier, which is that presidents largely didn't get the budgets that they had put up to Congress to consider. When you get right down to negotiation time, it ends up looking dramatically different than what's proposed. I was with Kylie today at a school here not too far from where we are, doing a tour of an elementary school. And I thought it's such a great thing to get members of Congress, but particularly the current majority, and especially in his role on the elementary and secondary committee, into classrooms, particularly elementary school classrooms, where they can see right in front of them vividly what our work is all about. So it was a good thing, and we got to keep working on them. So, yeah.
And all I'll jump in with there is, first of all, I live as a resident in Virginia. So we are an East Coast state that goes to the ballot box by April 21st to decide if we're going to do a redistricting as well. So I'll be interested to see what my state does there as it relates to possibly reshaping how congressional seats are allocated. The second thing I'll say is, to the extent that Kevin and I are agreeing with each other, a little bit of an echo chamber, that this budget is largely performative as it's introduced. I do think it's important to hold space for it as the policy document that it represents, because it is an election year. And to the extent that we've seen a president and House Republicans in particular introduce budgets that are very bad for education, there's an element of, I know I can introduce this and talk about it in my home district and talk about it to the base and be accountable to this base that wants to see no Department of Ed, while at the same time knowing that not only is it not going to pass the Senate, these significant budget cuts as introduced by the House don't even pass the House. And so there's a
Right.
performative element of, let me sign onto a budget that says I'm for the cuts. I introduced it. It was all my peers who didn't vote for it. Right. And so there's a little bit of that gamesmanship. And I think that's very fair. It's a byproduct of how our legislative process is structured. But particularly in an election year, it's important to pay attention and give space to the fact that, let the bad budget be introduced. Let's be very realistic about how far it is or isn't going to go. The bipartisan requirement through the Senate all but makes this dead upon arrival. And then we will see how it shakes out. And the last thing I'll say is, when we look at the makeup of government, I've been at AASA over 18 years. My favorite government is split leadership. We've always gotten our best policy when it is not a trifecta, whether it's all three chambers Dem or all three chambers Republican. So if a switch in one chamber would possibly make some things break free. It's a different type of gridlock as well, but the best policy we've seen typically comes from a mixed leadership role.
Yeah. And to add on to that, one of the points I want to make is that when you have the arrangement we currently have, amazingly, with Republican control of the White House, the Senate, and the House, we've ended up with budgets that did not end up at the end of the day slashing education to the degree that, folks had set out to do. So what happens when you get split government? Let's say the House goes Democrat and the Senate remains in Republican hands. Instead of a debate, which is what we had, unfortunately, about how we're not going to cut, we are unfortunately not having a conversation in final budget sort of discussions about how much more we're going to increase certain programs. And you get more of that discussion if the Democrats are in control of the House and the Senate. In order to reach a compromise, it'll be about, okay, if you want to hold something back, hold back just how much more you're going to give things, rather than a big conversation about, are we going to at least get what we got in the prior year? And, the president has a couple of areas where he's proposing increases that make some people in the education community happy in a very narrow way. But the overall cuts, you can't be distracted from. That's what really matters. What's the net change in investment in education? And in a split sort of Congress, we have a fighting chance to actually have a narrative that talks about where should we be going in terms of increasing funding, rather than just a kind of hold and protect kind of stature.
And one more thing I would add there as an example of what looks like it might be attractive but isn't. In my role at AASA, I co-chair the IDEA Full Funding Coalition. It is the #1 legislative priority for AASA. And overall, the president's budget proposes an increase to IDEA. We still do not support this budget because it accomplishes that increase by direct cuts and consolidating funding from 6 other programs in a related manner. Generally, we don't support major increases coming from education, but in particular, the way they achieve this IDEA funding increase is not something we can endorse. And in good faith, I can walk both of those. I can say, and this is the response you'll see from the coalition in the coming days, we applaud the president for advancing a budget that aims or wants to increase funding for IDEA, but we are philosophically opposed to supporting that program by consolidating other related supports.
Yeah.
Let me jump in because Edgar, I think you and I will admit that listening to Noel and Kevin, it's like a TED talk on budget and government. So this has been fantastic. I do want to get to one of our viewers, Darlene Norman, and she's got a couple of questions here. So I'm gonna ask them both, and Noel, I'll have you respond. First question: can you please address the effects of losing IDEA Part D and PTIC's losing funding? How do we advocate for California to protect the California Deafblind Project? And then she asked, can you address the loss of funding dedicated to IDEA Part D for technical assistance for the state deafblind program, as well as PTICs for special ed? All right, a lot in those questions. So Noel, I'll let you answer.
Sure. And this is where a lot of your members are familiar, but maybe not everyone is. By background, I'm a traditionally certified teacher. I taught high school special ed. So IDEA is a personal and professional passion. Mom retired after 32 years in special ed. This is deep in our family. IDEA Full Funding Coalition focuses predominantly, when we say full funding, on Part B, grants to states. That said, through my co-chairs, who are the Council for Exceptional Children and the National Center for Learning Disabilities, we've expanded the messaging to talk about how the benefits and supports that come in Part B are much less leveraged when you don't have the complete support for all of the complementary programs, right? Because those dollars that come from the grants to states trickle down and support the early intervention, the supports for our deaf and blind students, and the technical assistance. And at the same time, those direct supports to the dedicated programs for deaf and hard of hearing and for the technical assistance, they support the implementation of the state grants. It's very circuitous. And so again, that's why a coalition like mine, like ours, can oppose the one thing we say we stand for, because the way you're doing it undermines the intent of the program. And I think you need your funding streams to reflect the authorizing language, right? Like any federal program has two pieces. It has the authorizing language and then the funding that makes it live. It's kind of like a field trip, right? You need a permission slip so it can happen, and then money to make it actually come to life. And IDEA as a statute has explicit provisions and authorizing language for these uses and types of programs. And your funding needs to support that. And that is part of how we'll push back on that. Darlene, if you want other more detailed talking points, I'm happy to get to them. If someone wants to drop my email address in the chat, always available to the members. Literally my job to do this for you.
All right. Noel Ellerson-Ng from AASA, Kevin Gordon from Capital Advisors. Noel and Kevin, thank you so much for giving us the breakdown of the federal budget. Seems like there's a lot for us to wait and see.
Thanks
on this. All right. Thanks guys so much for being with us. Folks, if you like what you've seen here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we invite you to like us, subscribe to us specifically on YouTube. When you do, you'll get instant notifications when we're about to come on the air for breaking news. That's if you turn your notifications on, and you will get alerts when we're going to come on for our regularly scheduled Wednesday show, the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Folks, thanks so much for joining us here on the lunch break today. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.